You're too hard on RWBY. This is the most annoying line I've heard when dealing with the RWBY fandom. Despite what most people may believe, I love being told I'm wrong. Ultimately, if you make a good argument against any point I make in my videos, I'll debate you on said point. Even if you feel the need to insult me for whatever reason, I'll still debate you. My point is that if you think I'm wrong about any of my points about RWBY, I welcome you to tell me what I'm wrong about. The issue is that sometimes I don't get told I'm wrong. Instead, I'll be told by a RWBY fan in the comments something like, "You're too hard on the series because Rooster Teeth was just a small studio trying its best." I had a whole back and forth on this issue with someone in my Coco video where they argued about why it's never explained how Coco can mow down a bunch of Grimm all at once in the series. Their response was practically what I just said. They argued that Rooster Teeth didn't have the time because it's a small studio, they had to pick and choose who got more focus. Then, when I argued against their points, they doubled down saying, it's hard for any series with a large cast to have time to cover all characters, and that hindsight is always 2020, and they just realized the cast was bigger than Team RWBY. You know, the four girls Rooster Teeth named the series after? I know this isn't all the fans. I want to make that clear. I discovered many great people because of RWBY, and I won't sit here and pretend all of them are bad. However, the fandom is also hurting RWBY, and chances are if it ever returns, regardless if it's a continuation or a reboot, it will keep hurting RWBY. So why exactly is this an issue, and why am I arguing it needs to go away if RWBY wants to have a future? Well, I'm going to talk about that today. Here's why pretending any criticism is too hard on studios like Rooster Teeth does more harm than good and needs to go away. Before I begin, I want to make one thing very clear. I do want RWBY to succeed. I have always believed that the series had potential. It was the reason I was a fan for so many years in the first place. Me critiquing RWBY for its mistakes is not me saying it's the worst thing ever. You want to know what the worst thing I've ever watched was? It was Ocean Waves. And believe me, for all the problems I have with RWBY, Ocean Waves makes it look like Cowboy Bebop in comparison. But that's another video for another day. So let's start with the "you're too hard on it" line. On paper, that line makes sense. Rooster Teeth was a small company with fewer resources than Warner Brothers or Disney. There is an argument that if Rooster Teeth was bigger, they'd be able to do a lot more, such as more episodes this season, better animation, and even better writers. I'm not denying that being a bigger studio would have its advantages. However, when it comes to what determines the quality of a series, the size of the studio is just one part of that. There are other things to consider regarding the quality of anything, whether it's a movie or a series. These include the writing, the characters, their design, and even the actors performing in said thing. Yes, having more money can make either of them better, but that's not guaranteed to make it the best thing ever. For example, look at Waterworld. For those that don't know, Waterworld was, at the time, the most expensive movie ever made. According to Golden Globe Awards, the film cost over $175 million, making it the most expensive film of all time when it came out. They also mentioned that it wouldn't be topped until James Cameron's Titanic came out 2 years later. My point in bringing up Waterworld is, despite its huge budget, the film didn't do well critically. On Rotten Tomatoes, the film has a 47% score, and on IMDb, it gives it a 6.3. Doug Walker even reviewed it as a nostalgia critic, saying the worst thing about the film is it's just okay.
Maybe in a way that's its worst crime. One of the most expensive movies of all time, and it's just okay. It's not spectacularly bad or spectacularly good, it's just okay. For many moviegoers, simply being an okay movie is the biggest letdown.
Again, the point here is that I highly doubt the budget was behind the movie's critical response. In comparison, something can succeed with a small budget. For example, in the 90s, there was a horror film called The Blair Witch Project. According to The Independent, they had a budget of about $60,000. Not only did it gross more than the budget of Waterworld, but it was also highly praised for its originality by the famous critic Roger Ebert.
No single clip, I think, really can suggest the effect of this film because it's the way the action accumulates that makes it scary. The Blair Witch Project is creative and inventive and original and surprisingly disturbing.
I know it's divisive today, but the fact it still had the impact it did is still important to remember. Again, it proved that despite having a small budget, it could go on to be a major success. Also, while it wasn't the first found footage horror film, it led to more movies in the genre, including Cloverfield, which is one of my favorite monster movies. Anyway, to get back on topic, I know someone will say, he's not even talking about RWBY or Rooster Teeth, so why should we care? I'm making a point that it's Rooster Teeth's fault that RWBY had the problems it did. It wasn't because they didn't have enough money. It was because they made bad choices. What are those bad choices? Let's start with the cast. In most series, the main cast is usually kept small when starting out. Take One Piece, for example. By the time the Arlong arc finished, the Straw Hat crew was only up to 5 members: Luffy, Zoro, Sanji, Usopp, and Nami. Yes, other characters showed up, including villains in each arc, but the story still focused on them and their adventures. On top of that, the number gradually increased, instead of having all 5 of them on the crew at the start. It also helped each member get their own time to shine, instead of trying to relegate time to everyone. RWBY sadly has the problem of wanting to have too many characters from the beginning. There are already the 4 girls the series is named after: Ruby, Weiss, Blake, and Yang. Then there's Team Juniper, since they decided to treat John like a main character for whatever reason. Again, I wish they would have dedicated more time to Yang, so she would feel needed in the first season, but I've gone over that topic to death. So now we're up to 8. We also had to include Torchwick since he's the main villain of the volume, and just to be safe, since it is part of John's story, we should also include Cardin. So, for the first volume, this small studio decided the best idea was to focus on a minimum of 10 characters. Keep in mind that Volume 1 is less than 2 hours long. For the series, this means you had to fit the girls' first meeting and forming a team, Weiss being unhappy with RWBY as a leader and resolving that so that they're friends in the end, John dealing with Cardin blackmailing him and resolving that, and Weiss and Blake at odds with each other because of their thoughts on the Faunus, and again, resolving that so that they're friends at the end. When you have all those plots going in a short amount of time, it leads to it feeling rushed. All of this leads to another example of how Fixing RWBY did a better job than Rooster Teeth. They still involved these stories, but instead of rushing it like Rooster Teeth, Celtic Phoenix gave more time for all of that, including helping establish characters that would impact the series in the future, like Tuxton and Team Coffee. I know the counter to this is, well, of course Fixing RWBY is better. It has the benefit of hindsight. However, those fans are ignoring something. It was Rooster Teeth who decided to take on this burden, which is another example of their bad choices. They decided that doing too much too soon was the right thing for the beginning. If they fail at it, it's their fault because they could have chosen to focus on Team RWBY for the first volume and build up to involving others like John. I'm not saying you can't challenge yourself. It's how you grow as a person, and I think everyone should find a way to challenge yourself constantly. However, you also need to know your limitations. It's one of the reasons my book, Roxy Kitsune and the Desert Vixens, only focused on 3 characters in the first 13 chapters. I understand it's better to build things up than do too much from the beginning. Part of me realizing that was seeing how rushed Volume 1 of RWBY feels when looking back on it today. So I've clarified why I don't believe in the excuse that I'm too hard on Rooster Teeth. I agree they were a small studio, but that's not an excuse. However, as I stated earlier, the fandom needs to change the most if RWBY is to have any future. In the end, chastising people for giving the series any criticism will only convince people it's not worth watching. Sadly, regardless of what you critique about RWBY, a group in the fandom will always get mad at you for it. It's not even about countering the criticism. It's more about saying the person isn't a fan, so they don't know what they're talking about. This is unfortunate because they even do this to actual RWBY defenders like Judgmental Critter. For those who don't know, Judgmental Critter is a YouTuber who talks a lot about RWBY, both what they like and dislike about the series. Despite the fact that she's made it clear how much she loves RWBY, she's been treated like crap for daring to criticize things like Bumblebee, which is actually a ship she supports.
I don't know any other sort of fandom where I can say I want more LGBTQIA plus representation. I want to see Blake and Yang actually announce their love for each other rather than keeping it unspoken. I want to see more of this, and yet I get called homophobic for not loving the crumbs of representation the show offers already, for daring to imply it's not perfect as it is.
Do the people who made these tweets believe saying something could be better means you hate it? That's like assuming I hate French fries because I say they're better with ketchup, or that I hate the Steelers for saying they could have had a better offensive coordinator than Matt Canada. Criticizing something doesn't mean you hate it. YouTubers even point this out when they're giving negative reviews to things they enjoy. I may not know Judgmental Critter personally, but I feel safe in assuming if she hated RWBY as much as people think she does, she wouldn't talk about it as much as she does. While I haven't had the misfortune of dealing with the tweets like she pointed out in her video, it is something I still deal with when criticizing RWBY. For example, This person was complaining about how everyone they've seen complaining about RWBY just wants to make statements instead of debating the issues with it. So I thought I'd be a nice guy and change that by asking if Rooster Teeth wasted Yang in Volume 1. Instead of answering my question, they made a statement about how they don't view Volume 1 the same way they'd view a season. And when you view the first 3 volumes as one season, you get something decent. I immediately called them out for being a hypocrite since they ignored my question, just to make their own statement about how you should view RWBY. They have yet to reply to that. Another person replied that Volume 1 was an introduction to characters, and we already knew who Yang was early on. I was open to this discussion, but I still pointed out that Yang didn't do anything of note, to the point that not much would have changed if she didn't exist. They responded that RWBY was the only one who did anything of note during Volume 1. Before continuing, this is another thing I hate about the RWBY fandom. Before this, I saw a tweet where someone said about half of the people who critique RWBY didn't actually watch the series and are just repeating lines some haters said. Do you know how I can prove that I've watched the series? I actually talk about things that happen in it to prove my points. Like my response to this person who said only RWBY did anything of note in Volume 1. I responded by mentioning how Blake, Weiss, John, and Carden all did something of note during Volume 1. Whether I think Rooster Teeth did a good job with these or not, it's still an example of multiple characters doing something. I'm convinced the person only said this because they believed I was a hater that didn't watch the series. Their response makes me think this more, considering they just said not everyone needs an arc to be utilized. I responded RT agreed, since they forgot about the whole thing with John and Carden, so it was a waste of time. I also told them they didn't clarify how RWBY was the only one to do anything of note during Volume 1. They haven't responded to that either, so it's safe to assume I won't get a reply on that point. One person who replied was someone I had a pleasant conversation about this issue. They had their own thoughts about Yang's story, and summed it up to they were just waiting. While I still feel Rooster Teeth did waste Yang in Volume 1, it was a new way to look at things. I also thank them for being one of the only people I've ever had an actual debate about RWBY with that didn't end up with me being insulted or the other person tried to change topics. Unfortunately, that's been a rarity in this fandom. In the end, this is what it boils down to. While I understand there are still fans who care about RWBY and want it to continue somehow, they can also drive people away from getting into the series. And regardless if it's a continuation or a reboot, there will still be a vocal group driving people away. People have argued that it's better to continue and end the current series before considering a reboot. I get it. If I had stayed a fan, I'd probably feel the same. If you've been a fan long enough, I think you deserve to see how it all ends. However, think about it from a business perspective. You're 9 volumes in on a series filled with multiple issues people have complained about for years. You're asking new people to watch those volumes before the release of the next volume because most want to be caught up so they know everything. Meanwhile, if any of them dare critique anything about RWBY, the loud vocal side of the fandom will hate them and feel the need to point out how they're terrible people for not loving RWBY and not understanding that you can't hate anything about the series. So pretend you're that person I'm talking about. Does all that sound worth going through to see if you like the series? Honestly, part of me wants a reboot because I think RWBY deserves a fresh start. This would hopefully get rid of the toxic fans who believe they are helping the series. I also doubt they'd stay around if it were a reboot instead of a continuation. It's true that the problem could just happen again, but I also think that the studio working on RWBY this time would quickly shut that down. This is also what Rooster Teeth should have done from the beginning, but like their defenders say, hindsight is 20/20. I know this may come off as me lumping everyone in the RWBY fandom together and complaining about them, but that isn't what this video is. This video is meant to point out my issues with the RWBY fandom and why I think there's still issues today. Ultimately, I want RWBY to succeed, but I'm not sure it will if the fandom tolerates chasing people away instead of welcoming discussions on a series. If someone critiques RWBY, give them the benefit of the doubt and debate them. Maybe they have a good point about the series, or maybe telling them what you like about it will change their mind. I hated a few series at first, but hearing fans talk about what they loved about it made me want to give it a second chance, and now some of them are my favorites. Does that mean debating everyone will make them like RWBY? Of course not. Does it mean it sends the message that the fandom is welcoming and encourages talks about the series they love? Absolutely. But hey, if you disagree with me about any of this, let me know in the comments. As I said, I'll most likely debate you about whatever you think. Until then, I'm Marco Strange. Stay safe, stay strange.